Our first scripture lesson this morning came from Exodus. And I love the Exodus story. On my list of top Bible stories, it ranks right up there. Now, I love it for the same reasons that many of us identify with the disciple Peter. In the New Testament Gospels, Peter is the one who bumbles and fumbles and steps all over himself. Peter speaks when he should hold his tongue, he acts rashly, and he even admonishes Jesus. Yet, Peter is the one who confesses Jesus as God's Son. Peter is oh so human. The Israelites in the Exodus story are just like this. God rescues them and brings them to Mount Sinai, where he makes a covenant with them. And the covenant is, I will be your God and you will be my people. I will be your God and you will be my people. And God is always faithful to this covenant. But as we read throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites just can't seem to keep up their end of the bargain. They bumble and they fumble and they definitely grumble, which is where we find them in today's Old Testament lesson. Now, just 4 chapters before what Charlie read, God rescued the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, putting an end to that era by leading them across the Red Sea and even taking care of Pharaoh's army, who was in hot pursuit. Now, through the next few chapters in Exodus, the Passover meal is instituted, and God makes his presence known to them in pillars of cloud and fire by day and night. So the people who were lost are now found and cared for by the one true God, who is leading them into a new life. And after enduring so much hardship, they are safe from their enslavers and pursuers. All is well, and the Israelites heave this big sigh of relief. Whew. No more slavery, no more hard labor, no more living in ghettos, no more being beaten and living under somebody else's harsh rule. This is sweet freedom. And they lived happily ever after. Oh, no. Wait a minute. That's not how it goes, does it? 3 days out from the Red Sea into the wilderness, the Israelites run into their first problem. 1 chapter before today's lesson, in chapter 15, it says, Then Moses ordered Israel to set out from the Red Sea. So immediately from the Red Sea, they're going. And they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. 3 days out after this miracle at the Red Sea. 3 days, no water. And what did these Israelites do? Well, they complained. They murmured. They were discontented. There was no water. Of course they complained. We would complain too if we walked 3 days into the desert and didn't find any water. We need water. It's a basic necessity. We die without it. And I can only imagine how afraid they were. And we all know fear will prompt us to do all kinds of things, the least of which is to complain. The Israelites are oh so human. And in their fear and fretfulness, the Israelites show how quickly they will forget how God has provided for them. So the people complain to Moses, and Moses goes to God. And this is the first instance of what becomes a very predictable pattern. And God responds by telling Moses what to do to make the water drinkable. Moses follows God's instructions, and there is water to drink. All is well. and they live happily ever after. Oh, wait, nope, that's not it either, is it? The story doesn't go that way. So then we come to chapter 16, which is our Old Testament lesson for today. And a few weeks later, another problem comes up. No food. First, no water. Now, no food. The lack of another basic necessity. And again, the people complain to Moses, and this time they include Aaron. But here in their complaints, they've ratcheted it up several notches. If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Okay, whoa, what? I mean, things were better in Egypt because we had food. Yes, we were beaten and enslaved, but at least we didn't have to worry about dying from hunger. Wow. Close to 2 months in, and they already have selective memories about their time in Egypt. And they're questioning God's nature too. That God rescued them only to kill them out here in the wilderness. Talk about letting fear and frustration rule the day. Close to 2 months in, and they are again proving how quickly they can fail to remember God's faithfulness to them. They are oh so human. So in the face of this complaining and murmuring and discontentedness, how might we expect God to respond? God has just rescued them from their lives of misery and enslavement. God has led them out of bondage and injustice. God has tended to every need, including when Pharaoh changed his mind and raced after them. God ensured their escape from that life and promised them a new life, a whole new life, being a blessing to all the nations in keeping with the promise he made to Abraham all those years ago. God has saved them, and here they murmur, and they complain, and they are discontented. What kind of response do we think might be fair of God here? I mean, maybe we expect God to be angry for their lack of trust. Maybe we expect God to be disappointed in their ungratefulness. Maybe we expect God to say, I tried, but I can see now this whole relationship thing just isn't going to work. So thanks, but no thanks. Have a nice life. But there's no mention of that here. There's no mention of God responding in that way. Verse 4 simply has God addressing the issue and providing for their need. That's it. Just like he did back in chapter 15. God gives them water in chapter 15, and then here God simply gives them meat in the evening and bread in the morning. You need it? Okay, I've heard you. Here it is. Both times God simply responds to them and meets their needs for what sustains life, food and water. Such simple things, such huge things. And in doing so, God begins to shape these stubborn Israelites into a community of people who trust him for the very things that bring life. Every day, these Israelites must wait for God to provide what will sustain them for that day. Every day, for all of those 40 years that they wandered around the wilderness, they waited for God to provide food, quail and manna, every day for 40 years. They had to trust that God would keep his word to send what they needed so that they could continue to live. They had to trust God for life itself. And God was faithful. Even when the Israelites were not faithful, God was. And even when they bumbled and fumbled and grumbled, God was faithful. And by the time we reach Jesus' day, it doesn't look like much has changed with us humans. So our gospel lesson today takes place right after Jesus has fed the 5,000. And that's an event that so impacted the early Christian community that it's included in all 4 Gospels. In today's reading, we find Jesus and his disciples the day after this miraculous feeding. And the crowds who were part of this great miracle, well, they're still around, and they go looking for Jesus. And when they do find him, Jesus points out how they went in search of him only because he provided them with bread the day before, with food the day before, that satisfied their physical hunger. Predictably, the crowd has missed the point, and now it's time to try again. Time for Jesus to try another way to get through to these oh-so-human followers who are first concerned with what Jesus can supply them with. But Jesus says, okay, don't work for the food that perishes. Work for the food that I give you. And for just that instant, the light seems to dawn on the crowd, and they respond with, okay, well, what must we do? But it doesn't last for long, and they ask for a sign, which seems awfully thick-headed, as yesterday they just watched Jesus feed several thousand people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. At least the Israelites wandering in the wilderness made it 3 days. Here it's just a day later, and the people are already proving how quickly they can forget God's care. So how might we expect Jesus here to respond? What might be a fair response from Jesus? Maybe we expect him to be angry for their lack of trust. Maybe we expect him to be disappointed in their ungratefulness. Maybe we expect him to be frustrated at them for missing the point and following him for all the wrong reasons. But here, Jesus, God wearing flesh, the one who responded to the Israelites' complaining by simply meeting their need for food and water, Jesus, here, simply continues to teach, to work to break through to these oh-so-human followers who are more concerned with satisfying the craving in their bellies than the craving in their souls. Jesus meets them where they are. They are concerned with bread. Okay, let's talk about bread. Yes, Jesus says, God gave the Israelites bread from heaven that sustained them each and every day. They lived because God provided for them, and they had to trust God to provide. And God is still providing, he says. That's why I'm here. God has provided. I am that bread of life. And if you trust me, I will bring you a way of life that is more than what food can provide. If you trust me and follow the way that I will show you, you will have more life than you can imagine. Because God's nature is to give life. God's nature is to provide for us, to give us what we need, living water and bread of life. And when we look around at our world, it is really easy to fall into fear and despair. We start looking at all the scary stuff that's happening around us, and it's easy to forget how God has cared for us and given us exactly what we need when we needed it. But God does not give up on us, for God's nature is to keep trying and trying and trying to reach us. Included in your worship order today is a quote from Henry Nowing. It's in the reflecting piece at the very top of your worship order. And he says in that second and third paragraphs, "For most of my life, I have struggled to find God, to know God, to love God. I have tried hard to follow the guidelines of the spiritual life, to pray always, work for others, read the scriptures, and to avoid the many temptations to dissipate myself. I have failed many times, but again, always tried again, even when I was close to despair. Now I wonder whether I have sufficiently realized that during all this time, God has been trying to find me, to know me, and to love me." Now, what was way too long to put in the worship order is that paragraph continues with this. The question is not, how am I to find God, but how am I to let myself be found by God? The question is not, how am I to know God, but how am I to let myself be known by God? The question is not, how am I to love God, but how am I to let myself be loved by God? And finally, the question is not, who is God for me, but who am I to God? Who are we to God? Well, we are those bumbling, fumbling, grumbling, oh so human creations who forget too easily how God sustains us. We are those Israelites who jump to fear and worrying when we don't think God is moving fast enough. We are part of the crowd who wants to see signs, forgetting God's provision that we just saw the day before. And we are the ones that God has never given up on. For we are God's sons and daughters, loved beyond measure and cared for always by God's hand. Now Nowin finishes this section with these words. The good news is that God is scanning the horizon for me, trying to find me and longing to bring me home. And in the same way, God is looking for you. God is looking for us. He's looking for us. We are the ones that God keeps looking for again and again, over and over and over, because we tend to get lost really easy. We are the ones God keeps looking for to give us what sustains us, just like He did with the Israelites in the wilderness, drawing them close and meeting their need for what sustains life. We are the ones to whom God sends Himself, Jesus, the bread of heaven, the one who shows us the way to life, Jesus' way. Because when we do what Jesus says, when we love one another, when we practice compassion and patience, when we love our enemies, easier said than done, right? When we love our enemies, when we give of ourselves and what we have, when we practice mercy and grace, then we don't just exist. We have life, and life abundant. It is by no means the easy way, and definitely not the popular way, but it is the life-giving